Welcome to another episode of Near and Far, a podcast series on Catholicism around the globe. My name is Bill Cavanaugh, and I'm director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University. And my task in this episode is a bit daunting because I will be interviewing one of the best interviewers in the English-speaking world. David Cayley was the genius behind the Canadian Broadcasting Company's series Ideas on Radio 1 from 1981 until 2012. And under his leadership, it made the best of the scholarly world accessible to a more general audience. David is a Toronto native who graduated from Harvard in 1966, did volunteer work in Borneo and worked for Oxfam in Canada. And he began to see flaws in the standard Western model of development. And from there struck up a friendship with Ivan Illich, a prominent critic of this model of development. And David is the author of many books, including several that began as a series of interviews with Illich. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning.
Good morning. So I'm wondering if you can just begin by introducing Illich to the uninitiated. Who was Ivan Illich? Why is he the most important thinker that many people have never heard of?
Well, it wasn't always that way. When I met him, he was one of the most famous men in the Western world. But as you related, I spent a couple of years in Borneo in Eastern Malaysia between 1966 and 1968 as a member of CUSO, the Canadian University Service Overseas, which was somewhat similar to the American Peace Corps. And when I got back to Canada, I was quite puzzled about many aspects of my experience. It was Ivan Illich who I found most enlightening as to what had happened. So at that time, he was a Catholic priest who had recently undergone Inquisition, as it would once have been called. He was summoned to Rome by the Holy Office, and things were made difficult for him in the church, although he always insisted on, I think correctly, on his perfect orthodoxy. His educational and political activities weren't appreciated. And he eventually withdrew from the church, from the exercise of the formal exercise of his priesthood. He never withdrew, of course, from the church. That was in 1968, 69 that all that happened. In 1970, he published his first book, Celebration of Awareness, closely followed by Deschooling Society, Tools for Conviviality, Energy and Equity, and finally Limits to Medicine, also known as Medical Nemesis, in which he outlined basically a plea for a constitution of limits for modern societies, claiming that if they did not restrain themselves at some threshold, they would enter into what he called paradoxical counterproductivity. In other words, a situation in which institutions like education and medicine would begin to defeat their own purposes and generate so many adverse side effects, including primarily, in his view, the end of all human autonomy, that we would become creatures of these institutions and lose really our capacity to live and die in terms we can understand ourselves. That could probably be said better, but that was the first phase of his work. It made him intensely famous without, I think, any of his proposals being adopted. And it led on then to much more searching inquiry in books like Shadow Work and Gender, to look into the roots of our understanding of ourselves as trapped in a situation of perpetual scarcity, always in pursuit of growth, always in pursuit of more, never able to stop, never able to find the point at which human societies could restrain themselves and begin to simply live under conditions of what Illich once called enoughness. And that a final phase of his career in which I was very much involved involves searching out the origins of this modern mind and finding essentially its roots in the Roman Church and in Western Christendom. So he, like Charles Taylor and others, supposed that we live in a kind of mutation of Latin Christendom, which he summed up under the old adage, the corruption of the best is the worst. In other words, that through the attempt to institutionalize Christian understanding and Christian virtue, a kind of worst is generated. That's very abbreviated, but that's Illich in 5 minutes.
Okay, wonderful. Good. So I'm hoping that some of our listeners have heard of Illich and perhaps read some of his work, but I'm hoping that little 5-minute introduction will have piqued people's curiosity. You got to know Illich on a personal and intellectual level over the last couple of decades of his. Well, no, actually, I mean, you got to meet him as early as 1968, I think it was. Can you say a little bit about your relationship with Illich?
Well, I would say the first meeting, which was in the late 60s, it set the direction of my thinking in many ways. So I was always a keen reader of him, but a close personal friendship began in 1988 when he 87, 88 when he came to Toronto for a conference on orality and literacy put on here by some of the successors of McLuhan at the University of Toronto, of Marshall McLuhan. And by, well, I don't want to say by chance.
Providence.
It happened. It happened.
Providence is the word Christians use.
All right. It certainly was providential. Illich was a very sparing writer. He wrote at 2 occasions, he wrote what he felt he was called at a given moment to say. He did not necessarily always say more than that. He never felt he had a theory or a system to disclose. And so I was shocked and surprised at the end of a long interview we did in 1988 to have him declare that he thought that the whole of Western modernity could be understood, as I said a moment ago, as an extension of church history and as a corruption of the best, which is the worst. This, I had found no hint of this in his writings. I was intrigued, not to say overthrown, by this idea. And so I pressed him and we a little bit, and we got to know each other, and it happened that I became his amanuensis late in life. And in a second series of interviews done in the 1997, 98, he laid out this whole idea for me, because he never did write it down in any, he never developed the idea. He did lecture about it. And that became a book called The Rivers North of the Future. I had wanted to call it The Corruption of the Best is the Worst, but my wife talked me out of it, saying that was too distressing a title. So I think she was right. The the image, the rivers north of the future, comes from the German Jewish poet, German language poet, Paul Cézanne, who in a very short poem creates this image of casting his nets into the rivers north of the future, which I thought was an appropriately mysterious image for Illich's thought. That book was published after his death in 2002, thanks to the good offices of Charles Taylor, who contributed a preface. It began to come to people's attention in a way that he had not been able to get their attention in the last decade of his life. And I think he died feeling rather alone, even amongst fellow Christians. And I think that's not because others were not thinking along the same lines, but he wasn't in touch with them, and that's the way it was. So that began, a lot of conversations.
Okay. Interesting. And you kind of accompanied him up until his death, really.
Yes, we became good friends.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to start by just diving into the deep end here and asking you to talk about our current situation with the COVID pandemic and what Illich might have made of this had he still been around now. This is perhaps starting with the tail rather than the dog, but I think in a lot of ways, his response to the COVID pandemic might illustrate some of what makes him so hard to put into the usual categories that we put people into.
Well, can I begin with a story?
Please.
I was bemused, let's say, by the beginning of the pandemic in March, April of 2020. It reminded me of nothing so much as 9/11, when I had also been astonished to find that the deadly coup de théâtre that had been created by these men who seized the airplanes was instantly, seemingly understood by everybody as mandating, for example, these disastrous interventions in the Middle East, but also as indicating, as one Toronto columnist said the next morning, the end of the age of irony. So everyone seemed to instantly know what this meant, whereas I didn't think I knew at all what it meant, and was willing to consider that it might not mean anything much, except for those poor souls who suffered in it. And the pandemic seemed the same to me. Everyone was almost instantly aligned. Those who wouldn't go along with a policy of lockdown, as the British government for a week or two appeared not to, were brought into line quickly. And it seemed as if everyone knew exactly how this ought to be dealt with. But something called a lockdown, a term which comes out of prisons initially and later was somewhat carelessly applied in schools, I thought, now suddenly was acceptable to all, and the way we should go. It was a revolutionary departure from previous public health practice and conventional wisdom in public health, as a number of older public health professionals pointed out. Their voices were drowned out. So this instant alignment made me consult Ivan, as I would, and to write an essay called The Pandemic from the Point of View of Ivan Illich, which has had quite a career. Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, reprinted it on his website, and it quickly went around the world and was translated into almost all Western European languages. And I was surprised by this. But what I argued in that essay was that the only way you could explain this instant alignment was by a long preparatory period of practicing the habits of thought which it required. And these were exactly the habits of thought that Illich was interested in. So after he wrote his book, Medical Nemesis, which still imagined a kind of constitution of limits for medicine, he was asked 10 years later by the Lancet, I think, or the British Medical Journal, perhaps by both, to consider what he had written there. And he said, well, I wouldn't say the same things now. He had written in a famous opening sentence in that book, the medical establishment is the major threat to health. He said, I no longer see such a thing as a medical establishment. I see a system and a way of thinking in which people really are, the main threat to health, he said, is the pursuit of health itself. So he, in effect, said that the prediction he had made in the early 70s had come to pass, that we lived as health, safety, risk obsessed people, that these categories formed a horizon for us, which was very difficult to think outside. So I'm only supposing what Illich would have thought of the pandemic, but I think he would have thought that the way it was dealt with, is being dealt with still, it constituted a kind of arrival or revelation, if you like, of habits of contemporary habits of thought that have been developing for a long time, and which I think amount to a kind of health security state, in which it's impossible to from which it is very difficult to dissent. And this is nothing to do with Ivan, but it has been preoccupying me for the last year, that we have had an effective censorship since the pandemic began, excuse me, which has really removed all scientific dissensus, which is considerable, from our major media. It has simply not been there on the CBC, where I worked all my life, or in our major newspapers, etc. You simply wouldn't know that there's any difference of opinion. So I think Illich would have been dismayed.
So there's just what science says. We're told that science says this, and we all need to fall into line. There's no kind of element of political, social discernment on the basis of what the facts are. There's simply this kind of voice of science to which we all must bend the knee.
Yes, one of his great points in a book called Tools for Conviviality was that for people to recover their self-possession, if I can put it like that, they must overcome what he called the delusion about science. And the delusion about science is not anything to do with the proper practice of science or to cultivate certain styles of inquiry. It's to believe that there is this single oracular voice that speaks. It's called science. It wears a white coat. And so I think there was plentiful scientific dissent. Here in Ontario, a former chief medical officer of health was appalled by the policy that was followed. And I'm in touch with him. Several former chief provincial medical officers of health, but their voices were never heard. when three prominent epidemiologists created the so-called Great Barrington Declaration, suggesting a different policy. Their voices were not heard. That never appeared in any major Canadian media. So yeah, something called science, a kind of myth or idol, was created, but it didn't have much to do with individual scientists.
So David, distinguish what you're saying here about Illich's views from the views of a kind of standard libertarian who just says, you can't tell me what to do. I don't have to wear a mask. I can do whatever I want. I mean, there's a definite concept of freedom in Illich, but it's not a kind of libertarian idea of freedom. It's he also talks quite a bit about limits. Can you
Well,
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is he has something in common with libertarianism, and I think to deny that would be a folly. But he called in the 70s for a redrawing of the political map, and said that the left, and this was in an essay called Three Dimensions of Public Option or Public Choice, Political Choice, and claimed that the left-right axis on which we plot political choices is, tells you something. It tells you whether the state or the market predominates, but it doesn't tell you enough. So it doesn't, he said there would need to be at least two other axes, one dealing with scale and technological choice, because he held that there are tools that are too big to be controlled. So what is the nature of the technology involved and how is that assessed? And the other one running from having to being, terms he borrowed from his friend Erich Fromm. So having to being is essentially, does this course of action to be followed, this political choice, does it enable people to do things, or does it enable them to have things? I.e., are you getting an education or are you acquiring educational credentials? Because it was a preoccupation of his that people were becoming less and less competent, and that people were being prevented from doing things and looking after themselves by the predominance of what he called disabling professions. So if you take those are the two axes that are often missing in libertarianism, I think, right? If you just say, well, let's leave it to the market, right? So he would not outright denounce the line of thought running from von Mises through Hayek down to the contemporary libertarians. But his great teacher was Karl Polanyi, who was more or less the enemy of the Viennese school, which produced contemporary libertarianism. Polanyi being the historian who showed how the market is instituted and requires institutionalization. It is not a natural, it's not a primordial human institution.
So this is where his ideas on the vernacular and the kind of war on subsistence, that is the kind of attempt to suppress the vernacular, come into play. Could you talk a little bit about what Illich meant by the vernacular and this kind of war on subsistence?
Yes, I'd be happy to. He uses that phrase in for the first time in a book called Shadow Work, which contains several essays on what he called the vernacular. he recognized that he was coining or recoining a term, that there wasn't really a good contemporary term for what he wanted to say. And vernacular was an old Latin word for homemade, essentially, that he thought he could repurpose beyond the way we have used it in modern times to refer to sometimes to architecture and mainly to languages. So in that book, he has an essay about a Spanish grammarian called Nebrija, who was one of the prominent humanists of the Renaissance, who went to Queen Isabella in 1492, the same year that Columbus sailed, and proposed a grammar of the Castilian language and made arguments about how she could use this codified language to better govern and rule her subjects. So there you see his basic idea. If you run ahead to modern contemporary times, one of the things that people have lost is their ability to speak in their own voices. So not just individual voices, but the voice of a place, of a community, of a region. Generally, speech is modeled, coined by paid speakers who colonized popular speech. And so people very often don't know what the words that are in their mouths mean. They can't deploy those words to create personal meaning because the words have been, as it were, pre-formed for them. So the dream of a vernacular sphere regrowing is the dream of people regaining the capacity to speak in their own voices, to live on local and personal terms, to suffer, to die, to celebrate, to play outside of professional hegemonies. That's essentially what it means.
So it's the ability, it's beyond language, it's the ability to make a life for oneself that's not handed down by experts or subject to kind of bureaucratic control.
Yes.
Okay.
In the case of medicine, he argued that although medicine generates many side effects and indeed accidentally kills quite a few people, but that the primary problem is that the ability to suffer with dignity, which one may have to do despite medical intervention, and to die on one's own terms is essentially removed from people, right?
Right.
Life ends when treatment ends. There is no, that was, I mean, absolutely fundamental for him.
And he kind of lived this out in his own life. I mean, he went the last how many years of his life with a grapefruit-sized tumor on the side of his neck that he refused to get medical treatment for. Is that right?
That is true. He was not a fundamentalist. He accepted certain medical interventions, and it was a big part of his argument in Medical Nemesis that there should be, a generally available kit of medical interventions. But in this case, he decided that this illness was his to bear. He had various friends made him think that way. Yes, and he bore this painful tumor for the last 20 years of his life.
So this is another manifestation of what he means by the vernacular. It's the ability to manage and decide one's own life, one's own body, one's own attitude towards suffering, and the meaning of one's own death, I suppose.
Yes, he was very, very radical about that. He wrote sometime in the last part of his life a manifesto called Hygienic Autonomy, which just insists on that for people. The
So
right to die without diagnosis, he says.
Right, right. Yeah. So the war on subsistence that he talked about is, Wendell Berry talks about this as well, the way that we delegate responsibility for our lives to other people. We delegate education to professional educators, and our bodies to the medical profession, and so on. And he saw this as kind of one of the ills of Western ideas of development, that we're always and still, enclosing common lands and handing them over to private corporations because it's going to increase efficiency and so on, and pushing people from subsistence farming into into factories or manual labor, wage labor. In this, he's very close to Marx, really, Marx's critique of the enclosure movement and the movement of people from subsistence into factories and so on. But he's quite different from Marx in another way, though. One of the chapters in your book is called Illich as Revolutionary, and Marx wants a kind of top-down political revolution, and Illich is talking about a very different kind of revolution. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Just to pick up the word subsistence before we do that. I mean, that was a tough word to deploy, because it has a very strongly established meaning as kind of bare minimum.
So it sounds like you're romanticizing poverty.
Sounds like you're romanticizing poverty. And he, despite all his best efforts, I think was often seen that way. But subsistence for him meant livelihood gained outside the market. It meant whatever, however people gain livelihood. So that was a problem in being understood. As to him and Marx, he certainly was a keen reader of Marx and very interested. His main argument, he made it in a little essay called A New Theory of Alienation, was that Marx dealt only with alienated labor. Well, only. Marx dealt with alienated labor. And Illich felt that the problem under professional hegemonies was, you might say, alienated humanity, that one was removed, as we talked before about the ability to suffer or to die, or to grieve, or to celebrate, not to make it all sound negative, or to speak, that once those abilities are colonized, taken over, where one can grieve more properly under the guidance of a grievance counselor, then there's a new kind of alienation. And you might say that the new proletariat is humanity itself. That's kind of an exaggerated way of putting it, but it's humanity in the sense of humanness as well as of human beings. And so he, in Tools for Conviviality, his most general statement is, he puts forward the argument that the majority of mankind can still avoid going through all these modern stages if they would only drop the stage theory, which claimed that, I mean, the main claim in the so-called development decade, we're now in the 1960s, was that all societies have the same destiny. They will go through the same development and they will come to the same shining city in the end, right?
Which is
Well,
us, right?
which is-
Western Europe and the United States.
Which is
Everybody wants to be like us.
Which was why it was so valuable to the people in Borneo to have me arrive at age 22 to show them the way to the shining city. Yeah. So you know, he was trying to defeat that stage theory and say that people could, and this is, you know, this is disputed about Marx. Did Marx abandon that stage theory, that view that everyone must march through the same stages to get to communism or not? Did he abandon it at the end? Well, that's debated amongst Marxists. So, you know, but Illich clearly took the view that others could avoid going through these stages.
So a kind of cultural institutional revolution rather than just a political revolution, as he said.
I mean,
right?
in other words, he warned against what has emerged. If you look at dual societies like India or China, where you have a huge and ecologically destructive middle class, but you also have a much, much larger group that are not included and whose conditions may have been made worse.
Right, right, because you've taken away a kind of dignified subsistence.
Yes.
And traded it for something else.
Yeah.
So, David, I want to talk about Illich as a specifically Christian thinker. I mean, Christianity was not something added on to the rest of these views. It was something that was kind of deeply underlying the rest of these views. And one of the concepts that was really central to him was incarnation, with both with a small I and a capital I. As well, of the incarnation of God in the figure of Jesus Christ. Can you say a little bit about the importance of incarnation for Illich?
Well, this is at the very beginning of the book I mentioned, The Rivers North of the Future. He defines the incarnation as our freedom to love, right? To find God in one another. And as the event which announces that this, I'm afraid to say from now on, but which announces to some at least that this is how we will find God. So it really is that for him. So the encounter between one and the other, the bodily encounter between one and the other, since he insists that this is a real incarnation. The word is made flesh, the same flesh we have. So yeah, that in a way determines everything else that he thinks, I would say. That's the foundation.
So the connection with this concept of the vernacular is this sort of fleshly communion among people at a very personal and bodily level that is often then destroyed in this kind of tendency we have towards institutionalization and abstraction and disembodiment.
Yes, he thinks the church is a celebrating community. And that And that
He hasn't been around very many churches.
and any, any community can be that, right?
Mhm. Right.
And he spent most of his later years amongst people who were scarcely Christian in the formal sense in which we had thought of that term before.
Mhm. So on the theme of this incarnation, he has this brilliant reading of the parable of the Good Samaritan that I continue to come back to. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, he took the parable of the Samaritan as a paradigm, as a kind of a seed, if you like, of the whole New Testament. And he claimed that it had been widely misunderstood as prescribing a duty. That the question that Jesus was asked in that passage in the Gospel of Luke was, "Who is my neighbor?" But the parable has been taken as saying, "How should I act towards my neighbor?" But Illich said, no. What the main point of the parable was that you don't know who your neighbor is in advance, which the figure of the Samaritan is a figure of a quasi enemy. The northern kingdom of Israel and Judea were estranged, and so the Samaritan definitely signifies a foreigner. He liked to say a Palestinian to dramatize it. So the Samaritan who stops and bends to this wounded enemy, let me just say it, is doing precisely what he ought not to do. The two who pass by are doing what they ought to do, and he does it anyway because he's called to do it. And so Illich thinks this story should be read as suggesting that this possibility is always there of the personal response, of the call, and it could be anywhere. But he also recognizes, and this is an important implication of what he says, is that this also is a boundary breaking discovery or revelation, and can have the most catastrophic consequences in the sense of creating the society of universal care. I mean, not immediately, obviously, but over centuries and millennia. So, because, one definition of a society is people who care for one another and who can care for one another because it's accomplished within limits of language, of culture, of dwelling, and so on. So he sees the ambiguity of the tale as well. But yes, it centrally speaks about what is open to us by way of loving and one another.
And so the way that we've been taught to read it is that it universalizes care. So instead of just caring for your fellow members of your ethnic group or whatever, you care for everybody. And so the neighbor is everybody. And that then needs to be institutionalized.
It's possible the whole road to Jericho should be repaved and maybe barriers put up on the side.
Oh, Paul Ramsey has a whole thing where he talks about, well, why not have a police force to to keep the robbery from happening in the first place? And this is how you build up a whole justification for cluster bombing and whatever you have from the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? So Illich's thought is that the neighbor is not everybody, the neighbor is anybody that providence happens to kind of throw in your path, and you reach out to them, flesh calling out to flesh, as he says. The Greek word is that the man was moved in his bowels when he saw the beaten up, the Samaritan was moved in his bowels when he saw the beaten up Jews.
Yeah,
And he just responded in that kind of immediacy of flesh,
right.
calling out to flesh.
And
Right.
and for Illich, that is completely no one else but the one to whom that happens can know what has happened.
Right. Right.
It's a personal call. It can't be predicted. It can't be commanded. It can't be even observed from outside. It can only be experienced.
It can't be made into a Kantian categorical imperative.
Right. And that was what
yeah.
he claimed had happened.
Right. Right. Well, let me ask you a little bit then about Illich's views on institutions, because there is this then critique that comes out of this reading, which he says that, our care for one another, which comes from the gospel, it has been institutionalized. And this is one of the things he means by the corruption of the best is the worst. But people today don't need to be convinced that institutions are bad news, right? You think of the church, people are leaving in droves. You have the intermediary bodies between the individual and the state are withering away, the churches, the unions, the fraternal organizations, and so on. People are bowling alone. People are kind of isolated and kind of make different kinds of disembodied encounters on social media rather than kind of making community institutions and so on. Would Illich be worried about that? I mean, has the critique of institutions gone too far, or how would he navigate those ambiguities?
Well, I think he at a certain moment of historically what he saw as an historical opening, a moment of, Christians sometimes say kairos, so that he needed to raise this question of what he called institutional revolution. And that, well, we know what happened. He was not anti-institutional in any sense, I don't think. So I think it's important to understand that he had a complex mode of thought. I call it complementarity in the book, but he, insofar as you could say what his basic position in the church was from the time of his ordination in 1951 till the time that he was in effect thrown out on his ear, although he threw himself out. It was that tradition and innovation are a pair that can and must always dance together. The tradition could be the foundation of change if people could hold those ideas together. But of course, they're always separated. And so he was seen as, I mean, he was a very traditional Catholic in many ways, and a great lover of church tradition, as he was a great lover of the church. But he was also fearless in calling for what he named declericalization. So you can call that paradoxical if it's paradoxical to hold opposites together in thought. But I think it's very easy to misunderstand him on this point. It's not as if he thought there could have been no church. There was going to be a church, right?
Right.
And he understood that it was going to be a fallen church. He was humorous on the subject, tolerant on the subject. But that, so yes, I think he has to be understood in both these registers at once.
So it's no more paradoxical than having a pope who wants to attack clericalism and who wants to decentralize the church.
No, no.
That might be a good place to wrap up here. I wonder if you can just say, I was just referring to Pope Francis as a kind of sign that some of Illich's ideas have maybe have come to fruition or have come into their time. Could you end with a note of hope? Where do you see some of Illich's ideas or the currents of thought in which he moved bearing fruit now and in the future?
Well, I just, before I began this conversation with you, read a splendid essay by two young people who I have a book group in Toronto, and who invited me to come and speak with them a couple of weeks ago. I think Illich is being understood widely by lots of people. I think for me, the pandemic has posed the problem of how those who think alike and who would like to be peacemakers, who are not interested in joining the current war, and who stand in some way unnamed and outside the available categories, can find one another. I think it's probably pretty inept to use a monastic image for that. Although I think the monastic metaphor is helpful. And Illich, throughout his later career, called for ascetic habits. He used the term ascesis, particularly in relation to technology and the images of ourselves we derive from our technologies. So he was clearly preaching a new kind of ascesis. And I see many people that I meet as practicing that. So it's amazing how well he's understood in this essay by my two young friends, for example, how articulately. And I think that's widespread. I don't know how widespread, but I think we're going to have to stick together, comfort one another, learn how to address the world, and to manifest as best we can.
Well, David, if Ivan Illich is being understood well today, it's largely through your efforts. I want to mention especially your latest book, Ivan Illich, An Intellectual Journey, Penn State University Press, just out in 2021. The most comprehensive and interesting and really brilliant analysis of Illich's work that's available. So David Cayley, thank you so much.
Will you permit me a personal word at the end?
Yeah, please.
If it hadn't been for you, that book might never have been published. Your endorsement of it was, I think, a crucial moment in its publishing history. So may I thank you?
I am glad to have played a small role in that, but I think you've exaggerated the importance of my endorsement to that. It's a brilliant book, and someone certainly would have published it. It's a really wonderful, wonderfully done book. So David, thank you so much. This has been really enjoyable.
My pleasure.
Near and Far is produced by the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, a research institute focused on Catholicism around the world, with special attention to the Church in the Global South. The center is sponsored by DePaul University, the Catholic university in the Vincentian tradition in Chicago. Production assistance for Near and Far comes from Marlon Aguilar, Finnegan Chu, and Karen Kraft. For more information on the center and its activities, look for the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology on the web, Facebook, Twitter, Vimeo, and YouTube.